True Murder.
It's a rare insight into a killer's tortured mind.
The most shocking killers in true crime history.
Victims were brutalized, shot, stabbed.
And the authors that have written about them.
Bundy, Dahmer.
I would also play with Yash, like if you play with Sam.
The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author,
Dan Zupansky.
Good evening. Murder is the most vile crime known to man. It can be triggered by love or money or sex. Those are the three big-ticket items for homicide. But people are strange. They will kill for the most obscure and ridiculous of reasons. In 30 years covering murder, Brad Hunter has discovered each one has its own flavor. Cops and friends can be stunned by the evil lurking within a seemingly ordinary man or woman. In this collection of some of the most memorable cases Brad has reported on, there are serial killers, rich kid monsters, football stars, and wives in pursuit of hormone-charged hijinks, the very rich and the very poor, successful lawyers and hotel executives, Southern belles who could melt butter with a come-hither wink and a sexy drawl, daddy's girls with gleaming smiles, good marks, and possessed by the devil. These are stories of American crimes, and they stretch from coast to coast. You will find cheating husbands and wives so desperate for love that they'll kill for it. When the mob kills, it's never personal. It's strictly business. With the murderers in cold-blooded murder, it's always personal. The book that we're featuring this evening is Cold-Blooded Murder, Shocking True Stories of Killers and Psychopaths, with my special guest, journalist and author, Brad Hunter. Welcome back to the program, and thank you for this interview, Brad Hunter.
Great to be here, Dan. How are you tonight?
Fine, thank you. Thank you so much for joining me and our audience with this cold-blooded murder. Let's start off with just a brief outline of the stories that are in this book, starting with arsenic in the bowling alley. But before I start, just give us the criteria that you used to this collection of 25 stories.
I was looking for stories I'd done over the years that were more memorable, that had more of a dramatic arc to them than two guys shooting it out in a parking lot at 3 o'clock in the morning. A lot of these are tangled tales of love gone awry, sex and money are frequently players in them, bad kids. It's almost like sort of like an element of watching forensic files where you can tell within 5 minutes whether it's the father, the mother, the son, or the daughter, or some combination thereof.
Yeah.
But yeah, those are the ones I looked for. And I looked for another element I looked at too, was geography and place. But I like doing stories that have strong sense of place, of what's going on, whether it's a Rust Belt town in the Midwest in the late 1970s or early 1980s, or Los Angeles at any time, or small towns in Texas, that sort of thing. Those are some of the criteria. Those are the ones that kind of jump out at me. I mean, when I was on the road at the New York Post, I mean, they used to send me to do the flyover stories, as it were. And part of the reason was their logic was that I was from a small town myself. Brad knows how to talk to the farmers and the local town folks, so we'll send him, right? Rather than some guy with a heavy New York accent. So
interesting. The other common element of this collection is the truly horrifying crimes that are contained. Let's start with give us an outline of these stories as I mention them, and then we'll go more in depth to particular stories that warrant even more exploration. Let's talk about Arsenic in the Bowling Alley, November 2000.
Arsenic in the Bowling Alley concerns the matter of Ann and Eric Miller, who were a high-flying couple in Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina, a big part of the high-tech scene there. She was working for a computer company, and he was a pediatric AIDS researcher. She decided to play outside the marriage, and he slowly got sicker and sicker and sicker. And until finally an ambulance came and got him at the bowling alley on his last night, and he died. And it was later determined that he'd been slowly poisoned with arsenic. And that was so Anne could go be with another fellow, Eric Miller's best friend. And then he was her accomplice, and he proceeded to go into a garage and shoot himself in the head 2 days after Eric died. He is now a guest of the state of North Carolina forever.
Interesting. Your next story is Angel-Faced Monster, and this is in a place called Alba, Texas, and this is March 2008, in the Caffey family.
Yeah, this one you have what you have. I mean, some of the rebel without a cause elements. The Caffeys were very religious people and whatnot, and their daughter Erin wasn't particularly keen on that and wanted more independence, and like a lot of teens, wanted to do what she wanted to do, and standing in the way were her religious parents, who didn't like her boyfriend and didn't like much about the scene she was in. She was cute and everything like that, and on the night that the family was murdered, except for Terry Caffey, her father, who miraculously survived. They found her in a trailer, in a dingy trailer, her boyfriend's. She was, quivering, and what happened, but she was naked in bed. So, but as it unfolded, she had orchestrated this sinister plot to murder her family, get the money, but more importantly, to get from under that religious yoke and whatnot. Now, she was, and her co-conspirators were found guilty. Her father has said in the last number of years that he forgives her for that.
It's very interesting. You write that he became an ordained minister, and this idea of forgiving his daughter, he went to visit her twice a week, and they just avoided the entire murderous subject when he was visiting.
Yeah. And that's kind of the bizarre thing, that there might be an elephant in the room sort of thing, but people take comfort in religion, and part of the, I guess, difficulty with that level of faith that you can let a lot of elephants be in the room and not really say too much, and that's what happened there. I mean, only her age saved her from the death penalty.
Yeah.
And believe it or not, I know it seems like they give it out like candy at times in Texas, but that sort of thing, you would probably die for that in 20.
Interestingly, too, he was shot 11 times. And as you write and you describe, there are times when they just make sure he's dead, or they believe they're making sure he's dead, shooting him in the back. It's shooting him numerous times. And yet he drags himself 300 yards to a neighbor's home and is able to survive. And then, of course, give the police this tip that they probably would have got around to soon enough, but immediately they were right at this Charlie Wilkinson's trailer. And as you say, they searched the trailer, and lo and behold, they found a naked family member. And she pretended that what am I doing here? And so it was a fascinating story of survival. And like I say, it's rare people talk about this forgiveness, but the father going to visit the daughter twice a week and not talking about the subject is extraordinary. Yeah.
They were hardcore religious people. And it was that religiosity ran headlong into teenage hormones.
Absolutely. The next story you have is the I-5 killer. And you write that in October 1980, this horror show, and that truly is an understatement, began. This first victim was Cherry Ayers, and she's a 29-year-old X-ray technician. And she had earlier ran into her ex-classmate, Randy Woodfield. You write by sundown, she was dead. But in October 9th, they found in an apartment, they found other victims as well. And this Woodfield character, you write, Randy Woodfield, you write about his background. Who was this Randy Woodfield? And tell us more about this murderous rampage.
Sure. Randy Woodfield was grew up in Oregon, but he was a good football player. He played high school football, and then he got drafted by Oregon State, and at least several of the coaches thought that he could make it in the NFL. He had the size and the ability to get the job done. So, but there's a problem in high school that there's some flashing incidents in high school. Then there are more incidents in college, including a rape beef. But he manages to, with the help of football people, to slither out of it. He goes east. He does get drafted by the Green Bay Packers and whatnot. And they had him in their minor league team, not far a ways away in Wisconsin. And what happened there was he had his problem with flashing again. And there was like numerous incidents of flashing. Now, you can only cover up that sort of nonsense so many times. And then the Packers hung him out to dry, and he traveled tail betwixt legs back to the West Coast, where he kicked off his killing spree there. Now, they estimate he was only convicted of one murder, and they suspect he's good for probably about 40 homicides.
Right.
Up and down the I-5. The I-5 runs from the Canadian border to Mexico, and that spreads northwest. That was also worth noting the hunting grounds of Ted Bundy and the Green River Killer. It's a lot of remote areas and whatnot. Spectacular scenery, but a lot of remote areas, and perfect for somebody who wants to kill.
There was numerous victims that were racked up in this murderous rampage, and the crimes were horrific, sodomizing children and raping and murdering in brutal manner. The question you say is that, and the question they had at that time was what they thought was such a seemingly normal person, what could turn him into such a savage killer?
Well, you always look at the upbringing, and his brother avoided him. And they were on the same football teams in high school and college. And his brother wanted nothing to do with him. And so there's no scientific explanation for it, but it's sort of the bad seed argument. You know what I mean? He's just a bad guy.
The tally that you write, though, is the final count is 25 murders and about 140 other crimes, including robbery and sodomy and various crimes related to assault in this 1981 trial here. Now, the next story you have is the vile Mr. Winger and his wife, Deborah Winger. Tell us about this vile Mr. Winger and this diabolical plot that he almost pulls off.
Well, Mark Winger, he's in the Midwest. What he wants to do is like a lot of these guys and or women, wants to start anew, wants to start fresh. So he decides he's going to kill his wife. But he sets it up with this guy who drives her from the airport in Springfield, Missouri, a home that the guy calls, and he comes over and he basically frames this guy and he kills him. He kills his wife, and then he kills this guy, and he frames the dead man for murder, and took police quite a while to sort it out. And some of the other details emerging that he's a pretty horrific individual.
Yeah. And this is all thanks to there's a skeptical cop, but he has a partner that has a hunch on this. And so the skeptical is senior partner doesn't think much of it, but keeps it in his mind. And sure enough, he listens to him eventually. And so because he would have likely gotten away with this without a little bit of that, a dedicated cop looking at this a little bit differently. Let's talk about the next story, which is Orgy of Death. And I mentioned in the beforehand when we spoke that this is something I like to discuss because this is such a unique case. I'd never heard of it, obviously, but it just has some very, very unique and horrifying elements. Let's talk about Orgy of Death.
Sure. And this is kind of sort of back to time and place. It's the late 1970s in a place called Holland, Michigan, which is on the shores of Lake Michigan. And it's a storybook town that even the creator of the Wizard of Oz, L. Frank Baum, with summer in sort of thing. And
Right.
but at this time, it's also known for its huge pickle fact. But at this time, the local paint company was on strike, and they had brought in scabs and security to keep the paint flowing, as it were. Into this mix, now a lot of them stayed at this place called the Blue Mill Hotel, and that's where this woman named Janet Chandler, she was, I think, 20 at the time. She was a church girl in the choir, shy, didn't say too much. But what all these people brought in to the Blue Mill was drugs, boozing, loads of sex, lots of partying all the time. And effectively, Janet Chandler was leading a double life. On the one hand, mom and dad saw her as church-going Janet and whatnot, and at the hotel, she was going wild, and including, she greeted one of the security guards at the hotel in the lobby, wearing nothing but a cowboy hat and cowboy boots.
Right.
So that was quite a change from religious Janet. But in that fireball sort of environment, there was a lot of women and men, and a lot of them having sex with each other. Inevitably, there would be some jealous aspects as to what was going on. And one of the women, her roommate, in fact, a woman named Lori Swank, decided that Janet Chandler had to be taught a lesson. So she wasn't there, and there was $500 missing from the till. Cops think that it might have been a robbery gone awry and been grabbed on the night in question or whatnot. Well, instead, she'd been taken to a home, and she had been gang raped multiple times, and people were partying as she lay dying. But they found her body quite a bit later, and she had been strangled to death and raped. But there was a wall of silence over what had happened. In fact, the wall of silence remained in place for 25 years until some student filmmakers did a movie about it. Did a documentary about it, and that kind of was a bit of a kick in the ass for local cops. And then they began looking at it again, and they started with her, and they started getting the picture of what happened. And they discovered that she was living a double life, and they had determined that there were people that were there at the time she was murdered, and many years later, they arrested them. There were 6 of them they arrested, but there was 24 present at this gang rape, men and women, and some of them are dead now, and some of them are still in prison. Lori Swank was released from prison, but yeah, a fairly sordid story, quite tragic.
It's a horrifying description that you do in the book with these people present partying. You say that when she was actually tortured to death, or while she was being tortured, there was applause. This Lori was really upset that this Janet had sex with this Arthur Carl Pava. But the betrayal of her friend, this older man named Lynch that she had dated, helped crack this case as well in terms of the information that was provided. The horrifying information that he said he saw her after she had been raped, looked like she had been drugged with a belt around her neck already. And then later she was finally killed. And again, with all these people complicit and nobody said anything. And it took that many years, 30 years, to solve this extraordinary case.
Well, Lynch was a wreck by that time, and he had lived with the guilt of this for decades. And over time, he eventually, he came to trust the detectives involved and from the Michigan State Police, and told them the whole story of that terrible night. Now, I think probably he got a load off his conscience, but he ended up dying, I think, of alcohol-induced dementia. So it wasn't a pretty end for them. And it doesn't sound like there was a happy ending for anyone involved in that tragedy.
Absolutely not. Your next story is called Daddy's Girl, and this is in San Diego in a community called Rolando. There's a 911 call. My stepdad's been shot. And again, kind of alluded to it. Some of these stories, it's like a forensic files in that, oh yeah, I pretty well have a grasp of what's going to go on with this story. So this is called Daddy's Girl. Just tell us what happens in this almost obvious tale from the beginning.
Well, Tim McNeil was a very successful lawyer in San Diego. And he had married a woman. She had 2 children, and he had essentially adopted these children. I mean, when the mother had mental issues, and when they divorced, the children stayed with him, and he was unrelentingly kind to them. And his daughter, Bray Hanson, adored him. But what happened is that, she said that her father had been an intruder and her father was shot. And then, it didn't take long. I mean, her own family, his brother, they noticed that there were inconsistencies in her story, right? And she was taking a glib approach to the death. And to make, I guess, a long story short, she had recruited her brother to come from Arizona to help Kim kill Timothy McNeil. Now, but what happens is, this goes back and forth, and none of it would later make any sense. What kind of drove this death plot was that Timothy McNeil had started seeing someone new and spending more time with her, and maybe canceling lunches with Bray and whatnot to make time for this woman he had begun seeing. Now, she didn't like that, and apparently that was her motivation for murder. It wasn't money or anything like that. It was, the whole thing was revenge. And so they murdered him, and they both ended up very long prison terms.
Absolutely. You have another story called Homicide in the Heartland. This occurs May 2009, another 911 call. Police sent a car to check on this man's wife. And when police come to this home, very, very interesting, there is a message written in paint. It says, "I am always watching." And so the Sherry Coleman is dead. Her son, Garrett, 11 years old, is dead. And Gavin, 9. And so there's these expletive on the sheets even. And so both of these people, interestingly, Chris and Sherry, both work for the Joyce Myers Ministries. And was interesting, too, is the video footage didn't show anybody coming in and out of this house. So one of those where no forced entry, but the video footage doesn't reveal who might have been the perpetrator of this. So that's what they are starting off with. And it ends up where you have this person, Chris, he ends up with visible scratches on his face, like there was some altercation. And also he had some excuse he put out that he had been receiving threats for weeks prior to this murder. And of course, that was traced right back to his own hand.
Right back to his own hand. But Chris Coleman was a piece of work. And it was interesting, again, in some of these, fair number of these stories from the United States, that there are certain parts of it, that religious aspect to it.
Yes.
He was a bit of a high flyer in that. And he had, what his wife didn't know is that he had a girlfriend in Florida who he would see frequently and spend all kinds of time speaking with on the World Wide Web. And police got onto that. And his thing was that he wanted to, again, as we've said about 3 times, start a new life with this woman in Florida. But he got caught and is in prison in Missouri forever, with numerous appeals being torpedoed.
Yes, absolutely. You do keep tabs on all of this via something called Postscript. And so you talk about where these perpetrators would be in terms of parole eligibility. And most of them had the death penalty spared one way or another through plea bargaining or through moratorium on the death penalty itself. So most of them are doing some sort of, likely spend the rest of their life in prison. But some, as you mentioned, have been released and will certainly be released, won't they?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing because in some of the situations, I mean, to a lot of people the world over, the American justice system is very draconian, and it can be.
Sure.
But because you're sentenced to 150 years doesn't mean you do 150 years. Mind you, if you're getting 150 years, chances are that you're going to serve the lion's share of your sentence.
Yeah.
But and they will release them eventually. I mean, I don't see someone like Ann Miller getting out. Her husband had an agonizing death. she shot him in the back of the head, she'd probably be looking at less time. But that's what they determine as well, right? I mean, how horrific was it? A lot of these cases, pretty horrific.
Yes. Speaking of very horrific, you include the dating game killer in this collection. And so we won't go into that right at this time, but his murderous rampage was recorded in this book. In this, you talk about, and you included this as well, because there's a commentary on Southern California being the happy hunting grounds for homicidal maniacs of all kinds, and even serial killers, with the lure of California and Hollywood, not just for aspiring movie stars.
Well, yeah, California is, the author James Ellroy, who I interviewed many years ago and whatnot, he simply put it into a lot of ways for people who are true crime fans. Is James Ellroy said to me, he said, people come to Los Angeles to be someone else, and when you have that little self-esteem, terrible things are bound to happen.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things. I mean, in Los Angeles in the 1980s, there was the Hillside Strangler, there was the Night Stalker, there was the Freeway Killers, there was like any number of serial killers happening all at the same time. And if you know Los Angeles at all, it's a staggering number of different jurisdictions, and communication wasn't quite what it was back in the day. Somebody from LAPD robbery homicide sees something, he's going to raise an eyebrow, whereas the cop from Newport Beach, he's not getting it. He's not seeing it, right? So different levels of talent and whatnot. But I mean, there's people with troubles, not always with troubles and whatnot. And this was pointed out in Hunter S. Thompson's seminal book, Hell's Angels. And people sometimes are camp followers, bottom feeders. So they keep moving west and have, and they have troubles and whatnot, social problems or whatever.
Sure.
And they keep moving west until there's no place else to go. And it's the same as Southern Florida as well, right? Then boom, you're at the Pacific Ocean. There is nowhere further for you to go. And I think that kind of unleashes the beast to an extent. You'd think it might be, wow, I'm finally here, but it doesn't, because the problems tend to follow them. The way their psyche has been formed, a camp follower, if you were, which is probably the incorrect term, but hopefully you know what I mean. They're not true pioneers.
Absolutely. And you write in the end of the dating game killer that he remains in Corcoran State Prison, but there are 109 photos of this photographer of the unidentified women Rodney Alcala took, and they remain online to this day. 109 photos waiting to be identified.
Yeah, they found them in a storage shed of his, or a storage unit in Seattle, and nobody's able to connect these photos, which have various levels of disturbing. They're troubling. They're snapshots and whatnot, but they've never been able to link any of them to him. They know they're his. No one has come forward and said, that's me. No one has come forward and said, I know her. So that is like the John Wayne Gacy matter. I mean, Alcala's dead now. He died last year, but while facing the death penalty. It's one of those things like John Gacy, that the mystery surrounding the murders continue to go on and on and on and on, and seemingly without end.
Let's use this, Brad, as an opportunity to stop for a second to hear from our sponsor, which is ZipRecruiter. I had some personal goals for 2023, and one of them is to start working out again. And to do that, I'm going to hire a personal trainer to get me started and motivated. It's hard to find people who are so good at what they do. It's like if you're hiring, how can you find the best people for all the different roles on your team? Easy, ZipRecruiter. And right now you can try it for free at ZipRecruiter.com/murder. Why ZipRecruiter? Because when you see a candidate who'd be perfect for your job, ZipRecruiter makes it easy to send them a personal invite, and so they're more likely to apply. Let ZipRecruiter help you find the best people for all your roles. 4 out of 5 employers who post on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate within the first day. See for yourself. Go to this exclusive web address to try ZipRecruiter for free. ZipRecruiter.com/murder. Again, that's ZipRecruiter.com/MURDER. ZipRecruiter, the smartest way to hire. Now, Brad, we were talking about the dating game killer that many people are familiar with, that horrible story and that incredible character, even seeing the video of him on a dating game. And that's all over YouTube. Your next story is called Murder in Farmville. And you say the crime scene just resembled nothing less than a slaughterhouse. 4 corpses, people bludgeoned to death, a hammer, and a wood-splitting tool. And after that, these people were disfigured, their faces disfigured beyond recognition. An incredible story.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. It's it's one of those situations of be careful about the company you keep. This young woman, Emma Niederbrock, was a teenage girl who was into the insane clown posse. They would consider themselves juggalos. I don't know a lot about that world or necessarily want to. And they had met this guy through the internet who was also an insane clown posse fan. Now, the parents, her dad was a Presbyterian minister, and they were good, solid, middle-class people. They'd recently divorced, but were on friendly terms. And so the mom allows Samuel McCroskey, or a.k.a. Psycho Sam in the world of horrorcom. He comes to stay for a concert and whatnot with these people, with Emma in Virginia. Well, what happens is he has some issues and he freaks out and he murders Emma, her mother, her father, and her friend Melanie. And then he goes on the run. He's picked up at the airport. But the thing that's interesting about that story is going into completely different and very odd subculture. These kids were devoted. Now, most kids may be into Black Sabbath back in their day, but it didn't mean they were necessarily going to get out the Satanic Bible or anything. It's just a phase. But with McCroskey, this was more than a phase. And he bashed them to death with a hammer, caved their heads in. Really quite troubling.
There was this, and again, it's a reoccurring theme in why some people kill, but there was this incredible rejection of him. As soon as he came, they had dated online in this fantasy world, Emma and this Psycho Sam, and she was impressed by his credibility in this horrorcore rap business, I guess, or this culture. But when she actually saw him after a year, he was overweight. He was a shy loner, but
bad hygiene.
Yeah. Deal breaker always.
That seems to be a common theme here too in some of these.
Yeah, incredible. You have another story called Nasty Nurse. Just give us the background on this extraordinary story.
Sure. Michelle Michael, she was a nurse in West Virginia, from her high school, prom queen, cheerleader, and all that. And she ended up with a guy named Jimmy Michael, but she was always carrying on. She had a multitude of affairs. So what happens is that she skips out of work and rushes home, then goes back to work. And then she gets a call from the cops that her house is on fire with her husband inside. Now, she'd given him some drugs to essentially knock him out. And, or I guess what's better than knock out is basically render him immobile rather than being knocked out. And the house was set ablaze and he died in the fire. And what they'd found out was that, of course, that old chestnut insurance money and kicking off a new life with a new man. And they had suspected her for quite a long time, but they eventually got her. But she was not the one to take home to mom. She was kind of like Hillbilly Posh would be the best way to describe it, from where she came from and whatnot. And there was more stories about her. She got what she wanted. And apparently what she wanted was her husband, Jimmy, out of the way.
Yeah. You have this particularly horrifying story that you call Hollywood horror. And you mentioned Black Dahlia at that time in Los Angeles, Elizabeth Betty Short. But then you quickly go to the main character in this, and this is a Blake Leibel, a child of one of Canada's wealthiest families, grew up in Toronto, in Forest Hill, and raised by his dad, Lorne Leibel, billionaire real estate developer. And Blake lived this playboy lifestyle and drove Ferraris and race cars. And so, but it wasn't enough money from dad. So what happens, and what are his dreams? What are his aspirations? What does he try to fancy himself as, ideally?
Well, Blake Leibel wants to fashion himself as a comic book graphic novelist, Hollywood producer, mishmash of pop culture thrown into one pot. And he moves out to Los Angeles in 2004 and helped along with not only a massive inheritance from his mother, who passed away, but he's getting 18 grand a month and a mansion and all bills paid for from his father. This kid is super, super, super spoiled. But so he wants to get into this sort of world. And he hangs around with a lot of other Toronto Trustafarians hanging out in Los Angeles at the time, including his brother Cody, who was famous for being a pigeon for card sharps in Los Angeles.
Right.
But one guy I talked to who knew Blake Leibel, had dealings with him, and he was in the movie business, said even by the weird standards of comic book nerds that come in pitching their ideas, his hygiene was worse. He was weirder than anybody else in that milieu. And so, but he seemed to settle down at one point. And he married a woman named Amanda, and they had 2 children, but he was smoking reefer like it was going out of style at the time and not really having a whole bunch of success. I mean, he had the one book he did called Syndrome, but I don't know how, other than a concept, because somebody else wrote it, somebody else drew it, somebody else edited, and somebody else inked it. So he had actually very little to do, but the prosecutors eventually would call it a blueprint for murder, a pretty sick book. So him and his wife split up, and he ends up moving into a condo. And initially, he blows all kinds of money on his new girlfriend, Iona Cassian, who's a Ukrainian woman. And initially, he blows all kinds of money on her on trips and meals and all sorts of luxury, and even buys her a Mercedes. But he gets picked up for sexual assault in California. And this is around the time she's decided, it's 2016, she's deciding, despite the financial goodies, it's not worth it being with this guy. And that's even after she gave birth to their baby girl. So he wants to have a meeting with her, and he goes to her house and to their home, their shared condo, and he proceeds to torture her to death for 8 hours and point for draining all her blood. And when the cops arrive, he's in his underwear and looks out of his mind. A lot of the cops, this in Southern California, of course, gold standard in murder is the 1940 slang of Elizabeth Short, aka the Black Dahlia. So detectives and coroners are saying, because they've seen the Dahlia pictures, that it was worse than the Black Dahlia. It is like among the most heinous crimes ever seen in Los Angeles.
You write that part of the horror was that her scalp was completely removed and part of her face right side of it was torn away and she had been bitten.
Yeah, we can go ad nauseum about the gruesome details because there are plenty of them. And that woman went through absolute hell before she was mercifully released from this veil of tears. And at his trial, it was just like a no hope for her. And there's still, in Southern California legal circles, there's still a lot of belief that he should have got the death penalty, that surely it was a death penalty crime, but you could also say it was a matter of NCR. But I mean, we don't know that. I'm certain that he had the best defense possible, but his brother would sometimes sit in on the trial. His father never came. So I think he is now out in a prison in the California desert with nothing.
Let's use this as an opportunity to stop for these messages. Now, you have some more titles in this collection. You have the chapter called Cup of Lies. You have one called Comic Book Killer in Macomb County, Michigan. And you have a story called Boy Toy Terror. You talk about Elvis execution. And so there's some stories about Elvis as a perpetrator and Elvis as a victim. And these are noted Elvis impersonators. But you have a story called Hotel Air Horror. And this involves Ben Nowak Jr., a 52-year-old, and he's a noted, world-renowned Batman collector. Now, they find him, he has a stripper wife named Narcy, and he has a daughter named May. How do they find him? And this is what's one of the most horrifying aspects. How do they find him? What do police find him? What's his condition in particular?
Well, normally they're based in Florida. They live in Miami, but they find him in the hotel room in Westchester County where he was supposed to be at a show. They find him with his head essentially caved in, and they believe the murder weapon is a lamp. And it's a long way from home. And so the questions start rolling already. Is this robbery? Is this targeted? And they start looking at his past. Homicide detectives always look at the family first, and landed squarely on Narcy, who Ben had met while she was still stripping. He had a voracious sexual appetite, and he spent a lot of time in strip joints and whatnot. But Narcy had come to the conclusion that Ben had a new girlfriend, and there was no prenup. So her fear was that she was going to be kicked to the curb, and he would take up with a new stripper, and she would be left penniless. And that was ultimately the motive. And she recruited her brother and some other people to kill her husband, Ben Nowak. She later tried to blame it on her own daughter, who was close with Ben. And the other interesting thing is as it comes out is, detectives in Florida are investigating this as well. They take another look at the death of Ben Nowak's elderly mother, and they conclude that she had died in a fall at her home. New evidence that they turn up determines that she had been pushed, and that she had in fact been murdered, and that the perpetrator was Narcy Nowak, because the mother always hated her and wanted her out of the picture anyway. Interestingly enough, Narcy's now at the same prison as Ghislaine Maxwell, and they've become good friends, apparently.
Wow, that's fascinating. And you also talk about that this crime inspired the Lifetime movie Beautiful and Twisted, a made-for-TV movie starring Rob Lowe as Ben Nowak Jr. and Candice Bergen as Bernice Nowak. So that's fascinating. You have another story called Legally Dead, and you have another one called Sinister Scrapbooker, and take place in Ocean City.
Yeah. Sinister Scrapbooker is interesting. Erica Sifret, she hooks up with this guy. She was like a high school basketball star, and she's on a basketball scholarship, and she meets this guy, Benjamin Sifret, who's a former military man and whatnot, and they hook up, and they're going to do stuff together. Now, her parents are quite wealthy. She's an only child, so they indulge her. And she had a thing for scrapbooking, and so they opened a scrapbooking store. Well, the couple, they go down to Ocean City, which is a lesser known resort on the eastern seaboard of the United States. Nice beaches and, fairly affordable and whatnot. And they run into this other couple out of a night of drinking. Now, the two of them have been raising hell and doing all sorts of nonsense, but they hook up with this couple, and obviously there was something more going on, because they get them back to their hotel room, and they all get their clothes off. And I think the idea was to have a hot tub. And these two people were murdered. And this couple was found murdered. And so now they're in jail.
It's interesting that there's a ruse used in this thrill killing, very, very original. Instead of just killing them, they came up with a ruse that they had been stolen from. Well, where's my wife's purse? And so from there, then they said, this is the game we're going to play. You find the purse and you live. So that's such a horrifying fate for these people that think, oh, it's some kind of gross misunderstanding. However, it's just the diabolical nature of this game.
Well, yeah, they're both evil. If she hadn't have met him, it's always one of those questions. I mean, you can say Paul Bernardo never killed until he met Carla Homolka. So, I mean, it's one of those things, which came first, the chicken or the egg. I mean, she probably, if he'd settled down with some nice boy from her small hometown, she probably would have been all right. You know, she met this guy, and maybe this guy would have been all right too. BJ would have been all right himself, but together they were explosive.
Well, then again, she used this innocent scrapbooking hobby, but she scrapbooked the murders themselves and kept souvenirs like a necklace from one of the victims. So, and she documented everything. So very much, unlike your depiction, very much like a psychopathic personality as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. That's always the question too in these cases, is what pushes somebody over the line to, you know, go from being a nut to a psycho. Murderous psycho, right? I don't know whether anybody's ever really come up with that answer.
No, absolutely not. You have a chapter called The Suitcase Killer, a couple floating suitcases, blood leaking from them, and of course the sickening contents. It's amazing. There's two suitcases found, one with half a body and then another with the other half of the body.
Well, that's the case of Melanie McGuire.
Melanie was a fertility nurse, so that she was eventually arrested. She had access to drugs, this chloral hydrate, and she was arrested in 2005. Now, Brad, the last story in this book is called Coach Killer, and this is David Temple, January 1999. His wife, Belinda, she's 8 months pregnant. He says he went out to get some sodas. Tell us what they find and what is behind this story.
Well, what they find with David Temple is David Temple tells cops, and there are those in Texas who still believe he's innocent, but he comes home. I think he went to the store to get some pop or some soda or something like that, snacks, and he came back, and his wife, Belinda, was 8 months pregnant at the time. She was dead of a apparent self-inflicted gunshot. At least that's what he was telling cops, that he didn't understand it. And the whole rigmarole of malarkey. He didn't think, no one said that. But what David Temple was doing, David Temple was everybody's all-American sort of thing. The local football coach, which in some parts of Texas bestows a godlike visage upon a person. And that's what he was. And what he was doing was he was also having an affair. And they lived in this place called Katy, Texas, just outside of Houston, not far from Houston. And he complained in recent days about his wife putting on weight. Well, of course, she was pregnant, and they met in university and decided to spend their life together. He moved up the ranks of the coaching, and that took them to the moment of fate, their destiny. Unfortunately, or his destiny anyway, and hers, unfortunately.
After this murder, you write that 18 months after, he remarries this Heather Scott. So it takes them from 99 to 2004 till they arrest him and take him to trial. And of course, at trial, he has the famous Dick DeGuerin, a famed Houston attorney who had defended Robert Durst. But prosecutor Siegler, who you right now is the host of the true crime show Cold Justice. So it's quite the showdown in court when you have Dick DeGuerin defending you. So
quite a cast of characters. And I also covered the Robert Durst case when I was working for the New York Post. I got sent down to Texas to cover that. And I guess one of the forgotten parts of the Durst case is he was bizarrely acquitted, but he had chopped off his neighbor's head and
Yes.
tossed it in Galveston Bay whilst going around this Texas Gulf Coast community dressed as a woman. So, yeah, lots to unpack there as well.
That's incredible. You'd see that what money can buy is a defense like that after the fact with no witnesses whatsoever or seemingly any evidence to corroborate what he said in that it was self-defense. So with the best attorneys, you get the best defense, and an incredible defense he had in that particular case.
Well, DeGuerin got him bail as well, and that's when he went on the run, and before eventually getting pulled over in Pennsylvania after stealing a sandwich worth $3.49 at a convenience store, and he was arrested there. And that's when I flew back with him and 2 Texas Rangers back to Texas. Just sitting across from him, observing him for 3 hours was interesting enough.
In this collection, it seems that there are many, many stories of people that are not content with their relationships, and whether it be with their parents or be with their wife or their husband, which leads to the motive of murder.
Yeah, it's one aspect that's I've never been able to figure out that planned approach to something like that, because it seems to me, I mean, it's not condoning it, but that heat of the moment, knife in the guts or gunshot or whatnot between a couple, horrific as it is, you can understand that. But to plan it and whatnot, I mean, particularly when we know that you're the first person cops are going to come to. I mean, there's a thing they invented called divorce, and for many of us, it works very well. But it's that there seems to be something in the American psyche, an all or nothing sort of pulsion, that there's no half measures. There's no, well, I'll just serve her up with divorce papers, suck up what may come. So, I mean, that's the thing and you've got combustible combinations here of guns and religion and passion and racing hormones, and they almost all these cases end up being a gumbo of 3 or 4 of these different elements that become explosive. They become like dynamite in some people's hands. Most lovelorn teen boys just sit and mope, right? They don't decide to kill their unrequited love, her family, and her friends.
All these stories, though, very many horrifying aspects, as I mentioned, but also just the excessiveness of it. You have Terry was shot 11 times and survived, and they tried to kill him. There is the disfigurement. There's the facial disfigurement of some of these victims, the sustained 8-hour torture in Orgy of Death, the Jackson Pollock crime scene inspired with blood everywhere crime scenes, and the man hogtied with his eyes cut out. So these are stories that have a unique brand of elements of true horror all throughout this collection.
Well, yeah, I didn't set out to be the Ghoulmeister, but these also happen to be extremely interesting, compelling stories as
Absolutely.
well. I wasn't jumping into Wes Craven territory, but and that's one of the things, because I mean, these murders are just extreme examples of what sadly happens every day. They're just taken to the next level. I mean, if you look at the roster of homicides every day in North America, most, sadly enough, are utterly pedestrian. Or as a friend of mine who used to be a Crown attorney in Northern Ontario called them classic Northern Ontario murders, where one buddy stabs another buddy to death or when they start arguing over a hockey game on Saturday. But like a lot of these are just next level. I mean, there's obviously some true psychopaths in there. And if they're not psychopaths, then they certainly display a staggering array of psychopathic behavior.
Yes. Well, I just got to say this collection is beyond the pale in terms of just fascinating but horrifying, and just some of the background to some of these stories make them so memorable. I want to thank you so much for coming on and talking about your book, Cold-Blooded Murder, Shocking True Stories of Killers and Psychopaths. For those people that might want to take a look at your other work, or do you do any social media?
It can be found on @Hunter T, capital T, capital O, capital S, Son. So T.O. Son. That's my Twitter handle. Feel free to drop me a line, bhunter@postmedia.com, or you can follow my column on crime pretty much every day in the Toronto Sun at torontosun.com.
Thank you so much, Brad Hunter. Cold-Blooded Murder, Shocking True Stories of Killers and Psychopaths. You have a great evening. Thank you for this interview.
Thanks for having me, Dan. Take care.